Coasters unfortunately don't last forever, and with us now in the 2020s, it's worth looking back at some of the coasters we've lost over the last decade. In this episode, I'll be featuring 5 coasters that I'm sure will be missed by many. Blackpool Pleasure Beach's Wooden Wild Mouse. The Blackpool Pleasure Beach Wild Mouse was a true classic, and sadly it never got the proper send-off it deserved. Believe it or not, this was actually my favourite roller coaster at Blackpool Pleasure Beach until it was removed, and it was something really special. Opening over 60 years ago in 1958, what made this ride so thrilling was how unsafe and unlike any modern ride it felt. You sat in these small mouse-shaped trains, and the only thing that was holding you in was a sort of seatbelt you'd find in a typical car. And that seatbelt didn't hold you in all that much. There were trims and brakes in the ride, but again, they never really seemed to do all that much in slowing the ride down either, and it just felt incredibly fast and out of control. You could actually feel the rear wheels coming off the ground when it took these really tight turns and the car tilted. It was unlike anything else. I actually rated it as one of the top wooden roller coasters that I'd ridden, and its loss was something that I was generally sad about. The drops in the ride aren't huge, but they're definitely intense, and occur really suddenly, often after a sharp turn and then just a huge drop. There was also a powerful airtime hill on the ride too that could easily send you flying up out of your seat. Again, the car seatbelt barely held you in at all. It was this almost sort of reckless feeling that it had that made it so good, and you wondered how it was allowed to exist in these modern times of health and safety, and I think that's probably what led to its fate. After the end of the 2017 season, the Wild Mouse was very sadly torn down, without any prior notice given, and this came as a real shock to the roller coaster community. I think this is one of the worst things, as the ride just disappeared without celebrating its history or giving people the chance to ride it for one more time. After it was removed, the park also sold overpriced bits of the ride in the gift shop, and whilst it may be nice to have a bit of a historic ride on display, they were mostly just lumps of wood, and seemed more like the carcass of a ride that had been thrown away, rather than something celebrating it. Some tributes have been made to it, however, as the style of ride was added to Planet Coaster, so you could even try and make a more insane version of this awesome ride. Wooden Wild Mouse coasters are now incredibly rare, with my knowledge there's only 3 of them left in the world, 2 in Indonesia and 1 in Sydney, Australia. I was lucky enough to ride the Australian version in 2016, and while it was fun, it just wasn't quite as impactful as Blackpool's version. Volcano, the Blast Coaster, at King's Dominion. Volcano had a lot of fans, but I probably wouldn't consider myself one of them. I won't deny, however, that this coaster was certainly unique, and has a lot of interesting history. This launched inverted coaster was built around an existing fake mountain that had previously had quite a few different rides in it, and at one point was actually themed as a Smurf mountain. It opened in 1998 as the world's first launched inverted coaster, and was also one of the first inverted coasters ever built by Intamin. Unfortunately, the ride was notorious for long queues and poor reliability, and the times I visited the park, it frequently had breakdowns or just didn't open all day. When I did get to ride it, the 2 launches were good, but I felt the rest of the ride was a bit of a letdown. The track really didn't do all that much, apart from circle the structure and go through some rather uncomfortable inversions. The inversions felt like they were taken a bit too slowly in my opinion, and weren't that fun to experience, especially with the ride's over-the-shoulder restraints. Volcano did have its fans, however, and I remember back when I was planning my first trip to this park, a lot of advice was given about how to ride it and the best way to avoid queues. There was never another coaster quite like Volcano. All the subsequent inverted coasters built by Intamin were either their impulse coasters, which had backwards-forwards launches and a U-shaped track, or they had a more traditional lift hill, and a layout that was similar to B&M's designs. I'll remember Volcano for its uniqueness though, and the visual of it was pretty stunning. I hope that the space it's left behind will be filled by King's Dominion with a worthy successor at some point. Bobbaan, Swiss Bob, or just Bob, at Efteling. Bob at Efteling will always be kind of special to me, as it was probably the first coaster I remember riding multiple times in the same day. I was lucky enough to have a school trip to Holland back before I was a teenager, and as part of that trip, we went to Efteling, and this ride was my favourite. Back then, I knew very little about roller coasters, and I was actually too scared to ride Python, their other big coaster there, but I loved riding this bobsleigh ride. Back then, I think the Winter Olympics had been featured on television a lot, and the film Cool Runnings, about a Jamaican bobsleigh team, had been a hit at the cinema, and so bobsleighs were probably the coolest they've ever been in terms of pop culture. There was a long gap between those rides as a child and my next visit to the park nearly 20 years later, and in that time, it had changed a little bit. Most notably, the original trains were replaced with larger ones to increase the capacity, but I don't think that changed the ride experience very much. Interestingly, I'd actually encountered the original trains from the ride a year later on my first visit to Six Flags over Texas, as they now run on La Vibora, the bobsleigh coaster they have there. The loss of Bob is also sad, as it means there's now only 2 remaining bobsleigh coasters made by Intamin still operating. There are more Mack bobsled coasters out there, but they ride quite differently due to the trains consisting of several different cars rather than the Intamin's single car version, which is more free to move around on the track. At least the park has moved quite quickly to get a replacement for the ride though, as the new Max and Moritz racing coaster should open later this year. Vortex at Kings Island. Vortex was a huge Arrow multi-looping coaster that closed for good last year and is currently being demolished. When it opened in 1987, it broke several world records, standing as the tallest complete circuit roller coaster and also having more inversions than any other ride. The inversions consist of 2 back-to-back vertical loops, 2 corkscrews, and a batwing double inversion. It was announced earlier in the year that 2019 would be its final year of operation, and it closed on the 27th of November, but fortunately I was able to ride it before then. When I first saw this ride, it looked absolutely massive and very impressive. I can only imagine what people must have thought when it first opened and they saw a coaster this big for the first time. Sadly, as the ride aged, it declined in popularity as newer and more thrilling rides were built, and this was quite apparent when I visited, as it never had any queue at all. Despite its age, I still thought it was a decent ride. It was rough in bits and the transitions were a bit janky, but that goes with the age of this ride, and coasters of this size and style are getting increasingly rare. When it was announced that this ride was closing, I did at one point wonder whether the structure could somehow be reused, and a new RMC iBox track could be put on top of it. And I had a bit of fun coming up with how this could work in Planet Coaster, but sadly this will never happen, as the ride was completely demolished. It's left behind a large space however, and I'm sure one day Kings Island will get another ride there. The times I rode Vortex, I realised it was near the end of its lifespan, but it's important to remember coasters like these that broke records and were loved by many. Undoubtedly, Vortex will be missed by a lot of people, although its legacy lives on, as the keen-eyed amongst you might recognise the silhouette of this coaster from my outro video. Tower of Terror 2 at Dreamworld, Australia. The closure of this ride was really quite surprising to me, as it was the park's signature attraction at the time it closed, and it still stood as the 4th tallest coaster in the world. It was the main reason I went to Dreamland back in 2016, as the rest of the coaster selection is pretty underwhelming. The park's due to get a new coaster later this year in the form of a modified Blue Fire clone, but to me it seems crazy to close such a huge and iconic ride. Perhaps maintenance could have been an issue, as back when I went, it was closed when I first arrived, and I was worried it could spite me, but fortunately it did open later in the afternoon, and I got to ride. The ride experience was very similar to Superman Escape from Krypton at Six Flags Magic Mountain, with a long reverse launch and several seconds of weightlessness as the car climbed and then fell back down the spike, followed by a long brake run back into the station. When I rode, however, it didn't seem to travel anywhere near to the top of the tower, barely making it over halfway, which seemed like a bit of a waste of this huge structure. It was still a fun ride, however, and it's a real shame that the park couldn't keep it going. When it opened, it broke the record as the first coaster to reach 100 miles an hour, and now it'll be setting one final record, as the tallest roller coaster ever to permanently close. And so that finishes this first episode looking at the lost coasters of the last decade. If you've enjoyed it, let me know in the comments what other coasters and rides you'd like me to feature in future episodes. For now, I've been Rollercoaster David, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again in another video very soon.